See if I'm on? I'm on, right? Okay, good. Those of you who know me know I'm reasonably happy. I'm not that happy. If you asked me to clap my hands if I felt that happiness was the truth, I'd have to say no thanks. The reason for that is not because I don't feel that happiness is the truth, but because I only believe it's half of the truth. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is the other half, okay? So my topic tonight, and please don't run, because one of the things I'm going to talk about is on staying, okay? My topic is desolation and sadness, okay? And I'm not going to romanticize or celebrate it or say it's the best thing since sliced bread or that we should all go chasing after it. But I would like to propose, sort of stealing an idea from Stella, is that sadness is not a sickness, okay? As unpleasant as it is, sadness and desolation are places that we find ourselves, whether we like it or not, on occasion. And when we find ourselves in those places, what we need to do is learn to stay long enough to learn something and change ourselves. Two of my favorite things that I've been able to do as a professor here at St. Joe's are travel abroad, mostly to Latin America, and also teach a service learning course on hospice, and I've been a hospice volunteer myself for about 25 years. The funnest part of that has been I've been able to involve students in both of those activities. And one of the catchphrases that students use when we get in conversations about immersion trips and service learning is stepping outside your comfort zone. And I like that phrase. That's good stuff. That's one of my favorite ideas, is that we need to challenge ourselves not to stay too comfortable and to actually get a little uncomfortable once in a while. The piece that I think doesn't get talked about often enough is that usually when we do that, we're assuming that when we're done stepping out there for a minute, we can always step back into that comfort zone. We spend our entire lives investing in building these comfort zones and these comfortable places for ourselves, starting out in the laps of our moms and dads, eventually having security blankets. Comfort food is a big part of this. We have routines, we have rituals, so we spend this whole life building up these incredible fortresses of comfort places where we can go back and rest easily after a long day's work. What happens in my service learning hospice class, my students are basically going out 3 hours a week to companion people who are dying. 3 or 4 weeks into the semester, they come back and the conversation has taken a unique twist. All of a sudden they're saying, you know, we stepped outside of our comfort zone, but now what we realize is that we have in fact stepped into a discomfort zone that's not that easy to get out of. And that sounds like it might be a subtle distinction, but the fact of the matter is, I think those are two very different things. Stepping outside one's comfort zone and finding oneself in a discomfort zone. Buddhists call that bardo. There's sort of this place of transition. Theologians call it liminality. But you find yourself in this spot that's in between. It's neither here nor there. It's neither now nor then. And you find the firm footing that you once thought you had disappearing from underneath you. You find that the rules that have always governed your life and the predictabilities that were there that gave you a sense of security, they're suddenly gone, and you find yourself scrambling for something to hang on to. There's a Buddhist writer named Pema Chödrön who wrote a great book called The Places That Scare You. And one of the chapters early on in that book is called On Staying, and she insists that we grossly underestimate our tendency to bolt when we find ourselves in uncomfortable places, whether those are scary places or sad places or boring places or awkward places. We have this tendency to run as soon as we get ourselves in those spots. And I would agree with her on that. If you look at the way especially American culture works, we have an incredible tendency to leave, okay? We're watching TV, we get bored. When we're bored, we change the channel or go web surfing again. When we're in a relationship with a friend or a companion, and things become difficult or tiresome, we trade people in on new models. If we live in a neighborhood or have our kids in a school that suddenly becomes a little bit more diverse than we like, we move to a new house or change schools. And I'm not to say that there's never a reason for making changes in our lives, but I do think that as a culture, we're very practiced at leaving and maybe not quite so practiced at staying. My own story, very briefly, my own experiences with this sadness and desolation, and I could go on and on about just how crazy I actually am, okay? My first real experience with this was in the 8th grade, okay? In 8th grade, and basically it lasted for about 10 years after that. I won't go into the gory details, but my first experience was an anxiety experience that basically lasted from Christmas of my 8th grade year until around Easter. You'll see a pattern here in terms of seasonal affective disorder. My other big one that happened was in senior and high school the entire year. I was absolutely certain that God could not exist. And that sounds like sort of an abstract metaphysical speculation. For me, that caused some desolation that was pretty deep, okay? And here was the deal. I was a good boy. I was a good Catholic boy, okay? I was an altar boy and Boy Scout, A student. I volunteered at the nursing home across the street. And what I thought was that if you're a good boy, then you get to capitalize on that bad things don't happen to good people rule. And here I found myself when the doo-doo hit the fan in the 8th grade that all of a sudden this rock of my salvation, whom had promised me a safe place to run back to or a comfort zone, all of a sudden was nowhere to be found. So I felt deserted. I felt completely lost. I felt stuck, and I think that's the unique thing about this discomfort zone, is when you really feel you're stuck there. There was no staying about it. I wasn't staying there because I was so evolved. I was simply stuck there. And all the magical thinking and all the tricks in the world weren't going to get me out of it. Okay, so fast forward, I eventually got over this. I was probably diagnosable at some point, but nobody ever caught on because I didn't talk a lot about this. Moving into my 20s, things got easier, okay? These these places, I still found myself in these places, not as frequently, and I found it easier to deal with them as a function of having been through them before. So there was almost like a melancholy muscle that built up over time going through these. William James wrote a book. He's a psychologist and philosopher, basically wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. He talks about people like me and calls them sick-souled individuals in his book, okay? And he distinguishes them from healthy-minded individuals. And the healthy-minded individuals, those are the folks that always look on the bright side of life. They're the folks that say, you don't have to stay in hell any longer than you choose to. Okay? Modern day versions of that same thing are Norman Vincent Peale and The Power of Positive Thinking. Many of you younger folks have probably read the book or seen the film The Secret. Those of you that haven't done that have watched Disney's Lion King and heard Hakuna Matata, okay? Or Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry, Be Happy. And then our friend Pharrell Williams obviously has the corner on this happiness market right now. Well, now what was interesting about William James is after he gave fair consideration to both of these types of people, the sick-souled individual and the healthy-minded individual, he decided in favor of the sick-souled individual. And his argument was that the sick-souled individual was ranging over a much wider chunk of experience than the healthy-minded individual. So he described the healthy-minded individual as a person who was looking too hard in one place and turning a blind eye to the rest. Abraham Maslow basically several decades later said the same thing. He talked about what he called non-peakers. Non-peakers were people who couldn't have profound religious experiences, and the reason that it wasn't that they couldn't, he said that they refused to. So it was more a question of intentional blindness than actually paying attention. Hugh Mackay is an Australian social psychologist. He says we have become, as a society, afraid of sadness. Of course, now that's believable. If you think about it, he's from Australia, and Australia is where the phrase no worries comes from. Okay, I've got plenty of worries myself, thank you very much, but it does make a little bit of sense that that would be the idea there. Barbara Brown recently wrote a book called Learning to Walk in the Dark. She makes the same argument that we are afraid of dark things, and she's suggesting that there are qualities and experiences there that we're missing out on if we can't simply stay in the dark long enough to start becoming sensible to the what she calls the invisibles. Okay? Cornel West, many of you are familiar with him. If you take this idea of fear of darkness and fear of sadness and push it to its logical extreme, what you end up with is a chronic denial of death. Cornel West says that a chronic denial of death is basically the root of most of the injustices in today's society. And if you think about that, it makes a little bit of sense. The argument goes like this, is that healthy-minded person at his or her worst becomes very complacent about evil by pretending that it does not exist. I'm the old one here, so I have the luxury of relying on memory aids here. Bear with me just a second. Okay, so if you're buying what I'm saying here a little bit, let's suppose then that what we're going to do is we're going to toughen up, we're going to get gritty, and we're going to let our Debbie Downer sides or our sick-souled sides sort of rise to the surface, and we're going to get it sensitive to that. What's in it for us if we do that? There's a mood researcher out there named Joe Forgas, basically, who's done studies in this area recently that has found that folks in bad moods have a number of advantages over their happier counterparts. This is where I need my notes. This is part of the list of things that he found that people in bad moods do better than people in good moods. They remember better. They make more accurate judgments. They're less gullible and suggestible. They're less stereotyping, they're more persevering, they're politer. Now, I was glad to hear Stella say before there's no such thing as perfect research, so I would like to take a closer look at the methodology here, but at least it makes an interesting story and makes us maybe want to take a closer look. So I was surfing the net, I apologize to say, okay, sort of looking for at least one tidbit that I could include in tonight, and I ran into the Mayo Clinic's website, medical giant in the Midwest. And I ran into this piece, and I want to share it because I think it's apropos as we move into autumn here. And you guys know this stuff, so bear with me while I read. I'm just telling you what you already know. Seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, is a type of depression that's related to changes in seasons. SAD begins and ends at about the same time every year. If you're like most people with SAD, your symptoms start in the fall and continue into the winter months, sapping your energy and making you feel moody. Treatment for SAD may include light therapy, psychotherapy, and medication. Now it turns into an advertisement. Don't brush off that yearly feeling as just a case of the winter blues or a seasonal funk that you have to tough out on your own. Take steps to keep your mood and motivation steady throughout the year. Now I'm not opposed to light therapy, okay, or psychotherapy or medication for that purpose. But I don't like this idea that what we're shooting for is this steady state where there's no fluctuation in emotions. That's not to say that there's not such a thing as such a wide mood swing that we have a problem, but I would argue that a little bit of oscillation in emotions is a really, really good thing. If you look at religious traditions, liturgical calendars, the festivals that we celebrate tend to follow the seasons of a year in a way that basically sort of condenses the life cycle. Things are born, they grow up, they get old, and they die. That happens over the course of the year, and most religious traditions actually trace that cycle. Now, there's a Benedictine out there named David Stendhal Rast, who says if you take the Book of Hours or Gregorian chant, what a lot of religious communities will actually do is trace that same life cycle, not over the course of an entire year, but over the course of a day. So he'll actually take the day and divide it into 9 qualitatively distinct moments that trace that same birth-death cycle. If you look what Buddhists do, they condense it even further. They run through that entire birth-death cycle in the time of a single breath. So whether it's a breath or a year or an entire lifetime or a day, in each case what we've got is this rhythm of giving and taking, of being born and dying, of growing and dropping. And what I'd like to propose is that that rhythm is way too complex to simply categorize as good moods and bad moods. There's a lot more flavor and a lot more color in there than that. Okay, so I'm looking, and most of you have looked at your watches at this point, right? So there's 2 reasons why you're looking at your watch. Some of you are looking at your watch and saying, yeah, okay, I get it. I hear what you're saying. I can finish your talk for you at this point, and my examples will be way better than your examples anyway, so that's part of you, okay? And then there's some of you that are sitting out there saying, look, I've been sitting here listening to you for 14 minutes. I still have no clue what you're talking about, okay? So either way, what I need to do is wrap this up here pretty quick, okay? So what I need to do is talk a little bit about the so what. If you're gonna follow this line of thinking just a little bit and think about a few baby steps that you might take to move in the direction of learning how to stay in uncomfortable places, what might you do? And I've got 4, I might sneak a 5th one in, and probably way over time already, I'm sorry, okay? The first one is to start small. So if we're thinking about this idea of staying in a discomfort zone, I'm looking at these athletes here and I'm thinking about pressing weights, you know. I'm not gonna get out there and try to bench press 500 pounds to begin with. You start small, so that if you're gonna try to stay in a discomfort zone, find very small, everyday comfort zones to start in. There's a great book by Judy Leaf called Making Friends with Death, which sounds really perverse, but it's not. It's a delightful book. And she suggests that these little Bardo moments, or these transition moments, exist in something as simple as getting stuck in the checkout line in CVS, okay? Or getting stuck in a traffic jam, or getting stuck in a not too great TED Talk, okay? But the bottom line is if we can take those as opportunities to say, okay, I'm ready to get the hell out of here. Let me see if I can stay a minute longer than I was going to, and what you're basically doing is building those staying muscles up. Second thing is to be still. We heard some about this when we heard about self-reflection before. Absolutely, the simplest version of this is simply practice breathing. My big one is try turning off your cell phone for 3 hours one afternoon and just see what happens, okay? So that's an easy one. Third one is be patient. Instead of no worries, maybe what we need to do is no hurries. In educational psychology, one of my favorite ideas is what's called wait time. If anybody's familiar with the concept of wait time. Wait time is the amount of time that a teacher waits from when they ask the question until they can't stand it anymore and they have to answer the question themselves. Average length of time for a grade school teacher? Less than 2 seconds. What the research says is if that teacher can just stretch that to a little over 4 seconds, all kinds of wonderful things happen in the classroom. Everybody starts participating, critical thinking goes up, okay? So think of yourself as having sort of an internal classroom and look to extend that wait time. For those of you that are familiar with Walter Mischel's marshmallow study, with the 4-year-olds, you got this 4-year-old sitting in front of this marshmallow. Get the feel of that 4-year-old sitting there waiting for that marshmallow long enough that he gets it to turn into 2. That's the feeling that we're after here. I'll skip to the last one, and this sort of wraps it back to a point that was made before, and this has to do with what I call chew slow. It sort of ties back to Stella's point, and tasty food. Enjoy eating. I started out saying I wasn't going to talk about happiness. All I was really proposing is that we couldn't simply be happy all the time. One of the important things that Ignatius of Loyola says is that in order to be able to stay with desolation and learn something from it, you need to collect your consolations first. So to be able to savor life, to have all that richness and happiness walking into these uncomfortable moments will allow you to stay in those uncomfortable moments. If you can stay in those uncomfortable moments, and if, in fact, suffering is redemptive, the reason it's redemptive is because what those uncomfortable moments will do is create new interior places inside of yourself that will eventually make your happiness and joy deeper. Thanks for listening.